Welcome, everybody. We are here tonight with Guy Shennan. A lot of you probably know Guy already, but I'm going to do my best to give you a little bit of background on Guy so you can kind of see where he's coming from in terms of his experience. So Guy started practicing and learning about SF kind of was it early 90s, 1990s, a little bit before that. Practicing for over 30 years, originally as a social worker, which is near and dear to my heart and Loredana's heart, since we're doing that as well. Has done a lot of training, practice, worked on various different books. He worked with Brief in London, developed some courses with them. Yeah, a lot of different things, working more and more now with the Solution Focus Collective, which he just created recently. Lots of different work going on. So there's probably things I've missed, so I'm going to apologize to Guy on that now. Hopefully that will come up. Anything I've missed will come up as we go on.
Just wanted to add an impressive list of publications. Like if you check Guy's website, and his CV is really impressive. I don't think I've ever seen one like that.
Solution focused practice and effective communication to facilitate change. What compelled you to write the book in the first place?
Well, what led me to write the book was it was a bit of luck, to be honest with you, a bit of good fortune on my part, and it was possibly just after. Well, I think it was just after I left working Brief. That might have been a complete coincidence, but so it must have been way back in 2010. And Judith Milner, who some people here will know and some people won't know, Judith Milner, who's written loads of books, and she was at the time, she was a social work lecturer at Huddersfield University in England. And I think I might have first met Judith when I was doing the Masters in Solution Focused Brief Therapy at Birmingham Uni. Same time perhaps that Carolyn, who's here, would have met her, because me and Carolyn did the Masters together. And she might have come to do a bit of teaching on narrative therapy, I think. This was a great course, the Masters at Birmingham, ahead of its time. It was a little bit of integrative stuff going on. And Judith published on solution focused and narrative and all sorts of things. She approached me and said, "Do you want to write a book together?" So I said, "Oh, that would be good." Yeah. So she more or less gave me carte blanche on what the book was, and I'd always felt that teaching solution focused, the way I'd learnt it, which I end up calling in the book the brief version, not because it's a short version, although perhaps it is, but because it was the approach developed by Brief, obviously in particular by Chris, Harvey and Evan at Brief. As I was teaching, and people asked for recommendations for books up to this point, to 2010, I didn't feel there was a book which really contained the version that we all taught, certainly that I taught, my version of the Brief version. And so when Judith said, "Do you want to write a book together?" I said this to Judith, and I said, "Yeah, can I write a book about the version of solution focused practice that I use, that I think is, it's become mainstream now?" I don't know if it was mainstream then. And she said, "Sure, let's do that." And so the piece of good luck and good fortune, I don't know what would have happened if I'd just individually gone to a publisher to say, "I'd like to write a book about," because they'd say, "Who are you?" But Judith being published already, the publisher we went to, Palgrave Macmillan, she'd already been published by them. So they were very receptive, to say the least. So we just had to put a book proposal together, and they said yes. That's the sort of book I want to write, a book for all sorts of helping professionals. So I started writing it, and Judith was sort of commenting on the chapters, and then I wrote the chapter about what I then called contracting. I think what we called at Brief contracting. And Judith decided, I'd be better off writing it on my own, because that was more a book for therapists. I hope I'm not breaking sort of Judith's confidence here, but and at first I thought, "Oh no, I can't write it on my own." And Judith was fantastic. She said, "Yes, you can. That'll be fine." And then she said to the publisher, "Guy's going to write it on his own, and it's going to be fine. So just change the contract." And that's what happened. So Judith gave me a way into a publisher and then let me write a book on my own. So that's what happened. And I suppose I was inspired. So I'm ever grateful to Judith for doing that. And I guess, yeah, so I was inspired to write the book it was, you know, how come I wrote that rather than a crime fiction novel or something? I was inspired to write that book because I didn't think there was a book about the brief version of solution-focused practice. And of course, while I was still finishing off writing it, or maybe when the publisher had it, I don't know, Evan, Harvey and Chris flipping well brought out brief coaching. So there's a book, you know, about the brief version, but it was about coaching. So I thought, well, in terms of marketing, mine's still the first and perhaps only, I think, systematic account of how to do solution-focused practice, the brief version, aimed at anybody, as opposed to aimed at a particular. So I think that was the inspiration and a little bit of information about how I got to get a publishing deal.
Yeah. Okay. No, brilliant. And given you're in the second edition now, what's been some of the feedback from people? Like, what have people been sort of connecting with or jumping out? You know, like in terms of the readers, what have they been coming back to you with and telling you about the book?
Caroline Emanuel, who is a friend of mine, and we met on the Masters together. She said when she was reading the book, I hope I got this right, I could sort of hear you saying it, you know, hear your voice sort of saying what I'm reading. And so I liked that because, as I remembered by quickly looking at the book earlier today, thinking I better remember what's in it, given some of the questions you're asking. In the introduction, I say what I'm basically setting out to do is follow the way I teach the approach, you know, on an introductory training course. And so as I started writing it, I found great big chunks of it were easy to write because I was just thinking, what do I say next? You know, you hope that what you say is very fresh each time you do a training course, but clearly you're going to say some of the same things over and over. So I think I was writing lots of it, not all of it, but lots of it as I was teaching it. And that's what I set out to do. You know, I meant to do that. So when I had that feedback, I could hear you talking, you know, thought, wow, that's good because that's what I was doing. So it's sort of, in a sense, you could say it worked, you know. That's one comment. I mean, some people have put reviews, you know, on Amazon and said it's full of case examples that sort of bring it to life. And well, two people have said it's a book for social workers, and that's sort of, I thought, oh no, it's not. It's a book for everyone. It's meant to be a book for everyone. I realised when I saw John's SFiO sort of blurb introducing this event, you know, it's for sort of counsellors, social workers, consultant supervisors. And I thought, well, yes, it's not actually for people working in organisations per se, or GPs or others, but it's meant to be, in a way. It's meant to, because the intention of the book is to convey what I called in chapter 2, I think, the solution-focused process. For some reason, I've started to call that the solution-focused framework. And to me, it's a distillation of the solution-focused process that I think anyone who uses solution-focused practice, whether they're working with a whole organisation or whether they're a GP, a general practitioner, talking to a patient in a 10-minute consultation, or whether they're a teacher with a class, I think to some extent, in some way, for them to say they're using, or for it to be said that they're using solution focused, the framework that I try and convey in my book has to be in there. You know, so somehow, you know, there has to be some sense of a direction towards something wanted or something hoped for, and then a mixture of future and progress type questions, because that's what all I think solution focused is. You know, an establishment of a direction towards something hoped for, and then a mixture of future talk and progress talk by whoever we're helping. So I suppose I tried to convey the essence of that in the book.
There are some comments in the chat, Guy, if you want me to share those.
Yeah.
Mariana is saying, it was like I'm in a live training about your book. And then Rush is saying that is his favorite book in on SF practice.
Well, these are very close friends of mine, so that's no, that's very much appreciated. Yeah,
I thought, if I could say, I mean, we will talk about my favorite chapter later on, but in terms of the book, it's very easy to read and it's very easy to relate to. I'm a social worker, so as a social worker, I can look at this book, and you give examples from a very wide variety of settings that you've worked in. and that you got the examples from. So you kind of make it easy for us to see where it could be used and how it could be used. And the examples really help with that. And then you have the little exercises at the end that make us think even further in terms of our own contexts. So I really think that that is very helpful in terms of, you know, I mean, a book is brilliant. It can never replace the face-to-face training. So even if you read the book, you still, I feel, need to go for some training, but it is a very good tool to use after you've done the training and between trainings and things like that, and go back to it and remind yourself what the things are. So I think for me, it's a brilliant tool as that in terms of either learning, but also kind of keep learning, because you can't learn solution focus in one sitting, is it?
No, no. Can I just sort of make a couple of comments about that? Because I agree with you 100%. I appreciate what you're saying. Thanks very much. And I agree with you. You can't learn to do it from a book. I came across the antecedents of solution focused practice when I was a nursing assistant as a very young person in the mid-80s in an adolescent psychiatric unit. But then I sort of went away and qualified as a social worker, and I'd always sort of had this, I think there was a seed had been sown for interest in this type of working. Then I saw this book, A Brief Guide to Brief Therapy, in 1993, and I was a social worker in a standard, you know, social services department, struggling and looking for ways to help myself help people. And this book was by Brian Cade and Bill O'Hanlon. And of course, it's a great title, A Brief Guide to Brief Therapy. It's very attractive. You want to read a brief guide, because who's going to read a very, very long guide to brief therapy? So I bought it, and a lot of it is about MRI brief therapy, you know, the precursor really of solution-focused brief therapy. But there's a chapter, Exceptions, Solutions, and the Future Focus. It's a lovely chapter about solution focus. The whole thing, in a way, I think, is in a chapter. So I read this chapter, and I thought, well, that's great. That's really, what a lovely, simple idea. There's any time that people have problems, there's always exceptions to the problem. And I was a social worker working with families, and I went out to see a family the next day that I was seeing anyway. The mother, 2 sons, 12 and 14 maybe. Mum was telling me about they're always fighting, and she was tearing her hair out. English idiom, you know, she was struggling. So I asked the boys, can you think of a time? I mean, they must have told me something specific that they'd fallen out about. So I said, can you think of a time when that happened and you didn't fall out about it? You managed to resolve it okay? And they could. And they told me about a time. And I sat there and I thought, where's that book? What do I do now? And I didn't know what to do. So as far as I recall, it's a long time ago. I think I just said, well done, boys, keep it up. Something like that, which is a very, very lame thing to do. Maybe I didn't, but it was something like that. Of course, so that was not, and then it's exactly, I'm just backing up what you've just said, Loredana. I had to go on face-to-face training or training. We can do online training now, can't we? So I went on training and used to bore my colleagues at Brief about the revolutionary effect of going on the 4-day course with Chris in September 1995. And that's when because then and it was as simple as you learned to ask another question. So when that boy said, yes, I can think of a time, and said it, I just learned how to ask a question about that and listen to their answer. I mean, everyone here knows this. So, and then ask a question about that and to develop a conversation. But I don't think I could have done that without going on the training course. I guess the book chapter was the spark. And so, yeah. So I've written the book to support people who go on training courses, I guess.
Well, I think your book is giving a bit more than just that help to ask the first question. It gives you a very good idea about what questions you could ask next. I guess that, and also you conveyed the idea that this is just the beginning and you need to start the work now and keep practicing, because that's how you would learn it and that's how you kind of experiment with it. So I really like that about the book as well. Thinking about asking you the next question around what is your favorite chapter from this book that you've written?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's, I mean, yes, I enjoy reading that question and thinking about it today. I didn't think about it before today, and so I was looking at it and thinking, I'm not sure I've got one. And then quite a few of them started to become potential favourites, really. I mean, one was the last chapter 10, Becoming a Solution-Focused Practitioner, because I'd like to write another book, really. And I suppose if I've written the book based on an introductory training course, which in effect is what it is, then it would seem logical to write a book that's inspired by what happens when you do further training. You know, when people come back and they do staying brief or next steps or advanced training of some type. And chapter 10 is it's got a bit of that flavour to me. You know, there's this thing where you frequently ask questions. And to me, in my experience, these are questions that occasionally you get these questions as introductory courses, but my introductory courses, if they're 2 or 3 days, they're so packed full of the curriculum, there's no time. Got no time to ask questions on my courses, folks. But so you get on the advanced courses, you know, there's more space for asking questions. And so some of these questions, you know, what about the client worker relationship, and what does solution focus do with emotions, you know, and questions like that. And don't clients get irritated by repetition and all these questions? And so that's those sort of questions that people ask quite reasonably all the time. And so in terms of how to keep going and how to develop as a practitioner, I'm a sort of firm believer in talking about the approach. This is what we're doing now, really. And so I encourage people to explain the approach to others. And I added a bit in the second edition about telling stories. And that was inspired by reading an article in Journal of Solution Focused Practices, either by Michael Durant or by David Haynes. So is it Haynes or Haynes? That David from Australia. And David tells a story. I've got this idea that Michael reports this, I'm not sure why, about the first time he used the approach. And it's just, so it's really fresh, you know, and it's a great story. And that reminded me that I've told a story about the first time I used the approach in a very full-on way, which I did that 4-day course from Tuesday to Friday, went back home to Derby in the English Midlands, stamped my feet until the weekend got out of the way so I could get back to work and start using it. And then the manager of our duty social work team said, I'm telling the story now. So said someone needs to go. We had a duty meeting every morning to divide up the urgent visits and things that had to be done. And Wendy said, someone needs to go and visit this family this morning because the parent or parents came in on Friday, could no longer sort of deal with one of their children and saying, can't cope, needs to go into care. And we held it over the weekend with a promise of a social work visit. This is familiar, right, to yourselves. And so, of course, this is the moment when the social workers in the team would normally be looking at their nails, you know, or checking, you know, the diary. And of course, when I was going, I want to go, can I go, please? And it was like, wow. And so I went out and saw 5 people, mother, father, and 3 children, and did a full solution focus session. Came back and thought, I've just done a full session. And it was really, you know, interesting, and I hope useful things happened in that session. I went back and asked what's better later in the week, and some things were better. So when I read David Haynes' story, I thought, yes, this is, you know, I'm not the only one that was excited about my first use of the approach. And it's helped me to sort of talk about that first use of the approach. And, you know, I tell it as a training sort of story. David, so I put that into the chapter 10. Tell stories, tell people, you know, I mean, don't go up to accost people who don't want to know, but try and find people who are interested, and try and explain the approach. I said that before anyway. When I trained in 95, and I went on my own to the training course, it wasn't like I was with a team of colleagues. So I went back, and because my manager started to like the approach straight away, because she had a social worker who, when she said, who can go out and visit this family in this difficult situation, I was saying, me. So Wendy's thinking, wow, this is a good approach that Guy's learned. You know, he wants to go out and visit families. And I mean, Wendy was great anyway. So, and the team became interested. You know, it's a social worker working with child protection and these sorts of things. And you've got a colleague who's actually enjoying their work. It could be a bit odd. You know, so they were saying, what are you doing? What's this approach? So I started to explain it to them. And so I didn't sort of explain it to them because Joseph Schubert said to teachers to learn twice. I just explained it because they were asking me, what is this approach? And as I was explaining it, I, of course, started to understand it more and more myself. And I was enjoying explaining it. They were hopefully, you know, anyway, so that was the start of my teaching career, just telling colleagues about it. So I thought, well, if it helps me to explain it, it's probably going to help most people. So, so chapter 10's got some sort of tips or suggestions in it about how to develop your practice and how to keep going, and talking about it is one. And I suppose that popped into my head because there was that clear addition in the second edition, and realizing that, you know, reading David Haynes' story, it was a nice moment. It was like a light bulb, and it seems obvious now to me in a way, but, you know, here's somebody else who's enjoying telling their first story, you know. So hopefully there's other people here in this room thinking about their first uses of the approach. So that's my second favorite chapter. But I like the chapter Acknowledgement and Possibility, chapter 7 maybe. Am I talking? Is this? Should I keep going? You didn't ask me for two.
Yeah,
chapters.
of course. No, we were talking. Greg and I were just talking about that chapter today, so it'd be nice to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, it was just the end of it. Really. It was the end of it, really, because when I teach like coping questions and this sort of thing, sometimes feels a bit just added on at the end, because there's this process, you know, the best hopes, the direction setting, the preferred future, the progress, the scaling, and it's a sort of logical progression when you teach it. Obviously, it's not always like that when you're doing it with people. And then there's stuff about acknowledgement and possibility and coping questions and listening with a constructive ear, which is obviously I bring in much earlier in the book anyway. It's got a sort of separate nature to it. Don't quite know why I'm saying that, but no, I think it's not a separate thing. What I realized as I was writing it, and as I was coming to the end of writing it, is that this is just this acknowledgement and possibility, the phrase that I got from Bill O'Hanlon from one of his books. I talk about both and thinking like all the time, inclusive thinking, both and thinking. But when we're working with someone, it's always there all the time. Acknowledgement and possibility. There's always a balancing thing going on. And sometimes, you know, if someone's just off into describing their preferred future, you know, I mean, you acknowledge what they say. When I say acknowledgement and possibility, I mean acknowledging difficulties in particular, but keeping open possibility of change. So, you know, I used, so things sound really tough for you at the moment. You know, and Bill O'Hanlon says, try and have a foot in each of acknowledgement and possibility simultaneously. So at the moment, you know, a foot in possibility. And adding a coping question, you know, how are you getting through that? What are you doing that's helping yourself, increasing the sense of possibility? And sometimes when someone is really, really low, or their problems are really, really, you know, heavy duty, and you know they're sort of naught or close to naught on the scale. I mean, you've always got to have the possibility, but it's going to be like just laced with huge amounts of acknowledgement. And then sometimes someone's off and describing a preferred future. And it's just that's possibility. That's the possibility world, you know, preferred future. But it struck me right in the chapter that there's always that balance. And so I wrote the chapter as if this is a chapter about what you do when you're confronted with someone who's really, really, really got big, big problems. And as I came to the end of the chapter, I thought, no, this is what you do all the time, you know, with everybody. And I just added that at the end. So that's one reason I like it. And then another reason I like it is that I tell a little story that and it actually connects two people with similar surnames. Samuel Johnson, the what do you call him, English man of letters. You know, Samuel Johnson, I think he wrote the first, well, maybe not the first, but he wrote a dictionary in maybe 18th century, something like that. And I went to possibly a poetry event or some literature event just around the corner from where I live, and someone talked about Samuel Johnson. Bear with me, I won't be able to remember it without looking at the book. The only end of writing is to enable the readers better to enjoy life or better to endure it. Endure, yeah. So enjoy, endure. And so he wrote or better to endure it. You could just change the or to and. You have to enjoy life and to endure it. But I suppose there's a suggestion life could be good or it could be bad for different people. And so the aim of writing is, anyway. So I wrote, there is, however, a solution-focused both and alternative, and to his either or idea. And I talk about a coping scale. Thank you, John. Yeah, because I used this, what I call a coping scale, with two parents who were really, really struggling. It was the same sort of setting that you two, you know, work in Essex. And we were trying to avert, you know, trying to keep this family together and seeing this family using some solution focused work. And the parents were struggling like mad. And so at one point I asked a coping scale, I asked a variety of scales. 10 is you're coping as well as any parents could hope to in such a situation, and 0 is so-and-so has to come into care now, you know. And so I say the scale I used with John and Linda was a 0 to 10 coping scale, though any solution-focused practitioner would want to help their clients move beyond just coping to a more positive point. A creative Belgian solution-focused practitioner, Danny Jansen, I don't know if I was immediately aware that I've got this idea from Samuel Johnson and Danny Jansen from Belgium, has devised, this is something Danny put on the list quite a few years ago. I was working at Brief at the time. I remember talking with the Brief guys about it. Has devised an ingenious means of doing this, utilizing minus numbers and running two scales together. The idea is that we all have, and I think this is what, is the Bruges model, the Korsybski Institute. The idea is we all have limitations or constraints of some kinds in our lives, which we have to cope with somehow. For example, illness or disability, financial limitations, or the effects of past trauma. So at the same time, we have hopes and ambitions for our lives in spite of or within our limitations. So a client can be invited to position themselves on a -10 to 0 scale with regard to coping with an ongoing difficulty, and to explore how they have moved from -10 to 0. And simultaneously, they can position themselves on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 is, 10 is the achievement of their hopes, etc. So I like that. I mean, that was, just an idea from Danny that connected with, and these two, I must have come across these two things very, that thing that Samuel Johnson said, and then reading that on the solution focused list. And to me, it just sums up the both and-ness of that chapter. So I think in one way, that's the most important chapter, because that's what we have to do all the time. And then we have a solution focused framework overlaid on top of that.
And I think that's, sorry to jump in there, Guy. I think that's part of what jumped out to me from reading it was when and this is probably more from my own learning experience, but when you start out, you get that list of questions, don't you? And it's that shift. I think that chapter is a big shift from what you said earlier, which is I have to ask a question about what they just said to me rather than have my list of questions. So I think it's that, the listening with the constructive ear, and in a way, it's harder to teach acknowledgement, I think, straight out.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think it is. Yeah.
So I think it's just from that, it's that idea, the little things in there about, making it unique, I think is that thing of, this is where it starts to make sure every conversation is unique to the person you're talking with. So it's, in the earlier parts of the book, you're setting out that structure, that framework, and then it's almost here you're saying, don't forget, this is a unique conversation where you need to be, using their language and listening and acknowledging in a way that, I think you gave a couple of good examples in there about people saying, don't ask me another scaling question, or, this kind of thing. So I think it's that way of really listening and making sure you're connecting with people as opposed to just asking a list of questions.
Yeah. And I is it okay to mention posts on the list? I think it will be, but I agree with Andrew Colcott, who put on the list recently. And when I'm saying the list, I'm talking about SFTL, the list that Harry Coleman started all those years ago. And Andrew said something that's been in my mind for quite a few years as well. The more I think about it, the more I do this, the more I think that it's all about listening. It's just about listening, really, but listening for certain things, and then if you're listening out for progress and for people's hopes and preferred futures, that's what you're going to ask about, and that's what John Walter and Jane Peller said, in their book, Recreating Brief Therapy, which as a book and authors, I mean, that's a brilliant book. Questions are a way of listening, I think, that they wrote. And I think connected with that, it's a slightly different thought, but I'll share it because it might go. I'm thinking more and more, because we define solution focus by the questions that we ask. I think I've probably done that tonight, so it's, asking people what their best hopes are, asking people to describe their preferred future. Some people would say the miracle question, or just asking the tomorrow question, or these, and then asking people scaling questions, which is just a technique that we have. But I think you can define solution focus by the sort of talking that people do, or the sort of talking that I guess we encourage or we assist with our questions and our listening. And Steve and Wally Gingrich and Michelle Wanner Davis did this when they talked about change talk, in a really important chapter about what the workers did that elicited change talk by the clients rather than problem talk. And so I talk about future talk and progress talk, and probably not just me, but and it just suddenly hit me when I was doing some training a short while ago that these are two different ways to define what solution focused is, either by the questions that the worker asks or the types of talking that the person does. And I think defining solution focused by the type of talk the person does, it sort of frees us up actually and it makes it a bit less techniquey. And, you know, someone is listening out for any talking the person does that's about their hopes and their future and their progress and the instances and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's amazing. I think you give good examples of it in the book. That thing of, rather than people feeling, and this is something I hear from people on training courses, there's that pressure of, I've got to have that question ready, or I've got to quickly come up with the next question. Whereas when they stop thinking about what their next question is going to be and they listen in that way,
yeah,
the questions come, don't they? Because of exactly what you just described, because of what they're listening for, and through those lenses.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's an understandable pressure, isn't it? Because you know, we teach, you know, you to ask questions that connect with what the person just said, and we do need to find questions, I suppose, do we? But we need to find something to do to help people talk. So there's pressure on us to sort of do that. And of course, when we're sort of learning the approach, yeah. So I'm trying to find other ways of teaching listening and stuff, I guess. And there's a nice exercise by Raya Gul, Moan Moan Moan. It was also on the list recently. Just, you know, someone complains or grumbles about something that's been bothering them, and the person listens with a constructive ear. So I've got some other things I think I probably do, but I think this is still work to be developed, teaching in this way.
I would like to share my favorite chapter, Guy, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So my favorite chapter was the one on establishing a direction. I think is the third chapter. So the best hopes and all of that. And you talking about chapter 7 on acknowledgement and possibility made me think straight away about the difficult sometimes job that establishing a direction is, because if you don't get that right, then the rest of the process might not be as helpful to the client as we would hope it to be. And I'm really, I was really pleased to read the clarity and the flow in the chapter, and explaining it very clearly. What is the difference between process and outcome, and what the person doesn't want, and how you replace that with what the person wants. I mean, how they replace that by your questions being asked and things like that. And I just kind of, and then you go through all the difficulties and the kind of little things that clients bring in their own way of cooperating with the process, right, and with the helping activity that we're trying to do with them, and talk about their, you know, difficulties, and they're trying to explain to you how hard it is so that you can actually help them in the right way. And I'm just thinking about the importance of acknowledgement in that particular moment in time when you're actually asking clients what they want. And most of the time, in my experience, you meet people at a point of crisis, or a point of something is really heavy on them and they really want to change that, or there's some sort of very, very heavy thing that, you know, normally kind of moves people to go to ask for help. And you kind of show that very, very nicely in the chapter, how you sit with what the client brings and invite them into that kind of persistence, and thinking about what they actually want and what the outcome will be, and how you explain that to people reading the book, and kind of understanding, like, you don't just take it like the first thing the client gives you, or you don't follow the first thing that client gives you. I mean, you ask those questions to help them to think about what they want from that work. And I really like the example that you give with I can't remember the name of the second one. Is it Mandy? Where Mandy was, yeah, she didn't know what she wanted, right? It was many times that she said, I don't know, I really cannot think about this. And it was beautiful how you kind of helped her to think about and to find something that she wanted from this. And I like the thing that you say, that if the client is talking to you, even if they maybe it wasn't their decision or their idea to come to talk to you, that means that they want something from that process of talking.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that acknowledgement is also very important when you're talking to people and trying to help them establish a direction for the work, because they might be talking to you about very, very difficult things, and they might explaining to you about the really difficult problems. And if you don't acknowledge, it might not be very helpful, I guess, and you might not help them to think about that, because they will feel that they need to tell you more so that you can understand and you'd be able to help them. So I think that was my favorite chapter. Of course, I like the book. as a whole, but that was my favorite chapter, and kind of reminded me of the beginnings of my own learning of assessment. I was like, this is never going to work in social work. What are you talking about? We're dealing with desperate situations here. Yeah.
Well, listening to your talk, Loredana, you've made me think this is the most important chapter, really. It's interesting to think about. You've got to acknowledge, because of course you do, and that's what I was saying before about the other talking about the other chapter. But you have to but there's different ways of acknowledging. I suppose I'd say in that you have to acknowledge enough, just enough. And I mean, just to quote Chris Iverson, I'm sure he said once, cooperating with the client means doing what you need to do to enable them to answer this question. Something like that. And that's, and that might include acknowledgement. I mean, it's just a word in a way, acknowledgement. What are we talking about? Showing that you're listening, showing that you've heard, getting as close as possible. So with Mandy, I talk about getting as close as possible to her, but not right next to her. So the acknowledgement and possibility, the wonderful metaphor that Bill O'Hanlon uses about, curling sort of bowls on ice. When you have the person that, I don't know what the word is, curls the stone on the ice. And then there's the people with the brushes who brush like mad, and they've got to brush really close to it, so they've got to get close to it, but they're brushing to divert its course a little bit, so there's that sort of sense of because I think Mandy says at one point, this won't help, because the social workers told her to come, basically, I think, and she said, well, this won't help, and I don't like counselling, I don't like therapy, well, it won't help, doesn't help. So I say something like, yeah, maybe this won't help. So to get completely close to her, as I've said, you're right, this won't help, and then so I'm going to resign my job, and so I'm not going to say this won't help, but yeah, you're right, I didn't say you're right, maybe this won't help, but if it does, it's that sort of way forward. It's another tape I show, and the client sort of based, some of these clients are just based on people I saw, who I ask her what her best hopes are, and she comes out with a big list of problems, a very difficult life situation that she's living in. And I don't say much in terms of acknowledgement. And I sometimes worry that when I'm showing the tape on training, people will think, well, you've not acknowledged very much there. But it seems to me I must have acknowledged enough. And sometimes you're doing that in the room, it's an embodied sort of encounter, not just the words. Okay, so how will you know this has been useful to you? And she keeps, we keep going, we're together. So I think there must be sufficient acknowledgement, even though I don't say things like, wow, that sounds really tough. And, sometimes I do. There must be something happens that triggers one way of acknowledging or another way of acknowledging. But I think that if you ask what's your best hopes from coming, and someone tells you a list of problems, and you ask, okay, so how will you know this has been useful? That's you're acknowledging they've come. And so if you just acknowledge the problem, I suppose you're not acknowledging they're here for something as well. It's a thought I had while you were talking.
There we go. If you're all right, Guy, everybody's been patiently listening very carefully for a while. We wanted to open it up just to give people a chance to talk in a small group in breakout rooms for a bit, and then come back for a wider discussion, if that's all right.
Good plan.
Yeah. So in terms of the exercise, John is going to work his magic and put everybody into some small groups of 3, I think. And as we've been talking about, I suppose this acknowledgement and making things, it's about effective communication. So everybody here knows probably the structure and the way of the approach. So we want you to discuss in your groups something where you've had a conversation, and again, it could be something full on the way Guy describes in the book in terms of the full process, or it could be something else you mentioned, Guy, in your book, which is those impromptu questions and shorter bits of conversations that people can have. So it doesn't have to, it can be either or in terms of the examples you guys are thinking of. But we want you to think about, like, what was it about the way you did it? What was it about the way you facilitated it that made it so effective? And share that with each other in your group. And then we'll come back and have a bit of a discussion around what you've learned from each other, any questions you have for Guy, anything that stood out to you from the book if you've read it, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, I'm going to give you 12 minutes actually.
Right.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. So yeah, we'll throw it over to you guys, because we've been talking a lot and you've been listening very patiently. So we want to hear from you. So anything that's come up from your groups or questions you have for Guy, or if you've read the book already, things you've appreciated and just stood out to you, or yeah, anything that's come up as we've been talking, we would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts.
I love I love Guy Shennan, I must say. And I'm so glad to be here. I read his book twice, and I'm rereading chapters from time to time when I troubleshoot my something. And today, this evening, really struck me. I asked the guy in one of his trainings how, because I watched the videotape of his session, and it struck me how he's doing acknowledgement. I cannot pinpoint it, but today he told something about not always be in a word, but just maybe non-verbal message that you are here with your client and that you are carefully listening and staying with your clients. And for me, acknowledgement is beside listening with constructive ear. Acknowledgement is very, very important part of solution-focused practice, or any helping conversation. And I in these small groups, it is really my insight is about that when I look with magnifying glasses on some part of practice, I learn a lot, and it is really important to have other people pinpoint something that is important for them. And I don't have that much opportunity a lot, because I'm only practitioner in Serbia of solution folks.
Wow.
Thank you for being patient with me in my English.
No, it's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, it's great to hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's amazing. That's so, because I used to sort of say, I went to this course on my own in Birmingham and came back, and I was the only social worker in my team that had been trained. So it's a little bit different to say I'm the only person using it in Serbia. That's a bit better, really.
Oh, no, absolutely. And Loredana and I are just spoiled because we have a whole group of people around us. So yeah, definitely. Martin, waiting patiently.
And great to listen to Guy talking again, always is. And I'm probably not going to be half as articulate as Mirjana. That was a wonderful explanation about magnifying glasses and focusing in. Right at the end, Guy, you said, I don't know if I'm going off at a tangent. You said something about sometimes I do in the interaction. Sometimes I do something, sometimes I say something, sometimes I don't. And I'd been thinking about that recently. And the question really is, how do I know, how do you know? How do we know sometimes I do? Those moments when we ask either more, in our group, we were talking about, ended up about being more pushy with questions rather than less pushy. How do we know? And there's something about the interaction. I wondered if you had any take on that. Am I doing this right, Greg? Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely, Martin. Everything you do you do right, Martin. Don't worry.
Greg. So, Guy, so any more about sometimes I do?
I think it's really hard, apart from just paying very careful attention to the person that you're talking with, that you're with. I don't think there's not. I know you're not asking is there a formula, but I don't think there is one. I mean, one thing, I mean, this isn't answering your question, but it's popped into my head because it's connected a little bit. I was, you know, I'd learned not to echo the problem words, you know, someone, you know, so what are your best hopes? Oh, I don't know. I'm feeling terrible at the moment and I can't go out at all. I'm low and I've got no, I'm on my own, I'm isolated. Okay, so you can't go out at the moment, you're low, you're on your own, you're isolated. You know, I mean, that you'd think, well, that's not, you know, I just wouldn't do that. You know, I might say, wow, you know, that sounds really tough, you know. So what are your best hopes from being here? And I said that to something like that to someone I was working with about 3 years ago or so, and she said, "Are you listening to me?" And that's and then you're in trouble, really, because what do you say? Yes. Like, well, prove it, you know. And you just said that's really tough. I don't think you've heard a word I said, you know. So I was going to say, thankfully, I had been listening to it. I mean, I had been. So I said, no, I heard you say you were, and then I repeated every problem word she'd said. And I was like, okay. So then and then she trusted me. Then she realised I was listening to it. So there's no rule about it in that. But I would still typically say things like, "I'm sorry to hear that," or "That sounds really tough," or "Okay," or again, you know, I've learned a lot from Chris, and you know, when something heavy duty was said, you know, well, okay, so the stakes are high, you know, or just a look. I mean, again, tangential to this, but Steve, I'm sure I might have been there, or I might have heard a story when Steve DeShazer was asked. You don't say "wow" like Insu does. You don't say "wow." I mean, this is a different sort of acknowledgement, acknowledging something achievement someone's done. Wow, how did you do that? And someone said, you don't say "wow," Steve. And it was probably a humorous question. You know, he said, "No, I raise an eyebrow." You know, so I guess,
yeah.
So you're both fitting the person that you're with, and you've got to fit yourself. You've got to fit yourself, and so I don't say "wow." I might do occasionally, you know, but you've got to fit the person you're with. But so I try and talk in ways that are right for me.
Yeah. It feels like that. It's about the interaction. So it's kind of reassuring, Guy, to know sometimes when I say something and I think, crikey, that was a bit pushy or something, but somehow it keeps on track or whatever. So it's you said something about keeping knowing yourself in the interaction as well as keeping alongside the client.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, I did a supervision session with someone once after a training course, and it was part of, and one of the people that commissioned me, you know, I spent a day with their team. I did a supervision session, and the person said to me at the end of the session, I like that, I really like your style. You're sort of non-pushy. And I took that as a massive compliment, you know. Still, it was meant to be a compliment, and I thought, oh, good, you know, because I talk about being non-instrumental in the book, you know, not pushy. But sometimes I think I am pushy, you know, sometimes it helps, you know. So how did they notice that you were more patient? How did they notice? Well, I can't think of a good example, but I asked, what was it they saw? You know, there's times when I can be pushy with coping questions, if you like. How are you keeping going? You just got to, don't you? Well, some people don't. So how are you managing to do it?
Yeah.
So what did you do yesterday? There's an example in the acknowledgement and possibility chapter when that happened.
I think I did. Was it yesterday? I said, "So what did you do?" And I thought, crikey, Martin, in the back of my head, asking, what did they do? What are you going to do? What might you do next? I think something like that. But you know,
I think so. Caroline, can I just have a look at Caroline's question in the chat? Is asking for more detail pushy? And I don't think so, but I think it's the way it's done. You know, sometimes I'll interrupt. You know, if I think I've asked a question, the person's going off somewhere else. I said, no. What I'm asking is, how did you notice that? You know, and there's moments when you sort of get a sense it's okay. You know, I generally teach don't interrupt. You know, but you're going to be careful because then you could have hour-long sessions where nothing's asked, and you know, sometimes you do interrupt.
This is not a question so much as just a comment. I used to work in theatre, and I know that it's not just the words, and things can be said a million different ways. And what I notice about you, and what's lovely about reading the book, is I of course hear it in your voice. is you've got a kind of animated seriousness. It's something very terrier-like about the way you ask questions. And so, what about this and what about that? And that's what I hear. And then I love the way you put in pauses, or okay, comma, pause, and you know, so you printed all those pauses, so we can hear the rhythm of that as well. And there's wit always just below the surface, and that, you know, that's one of the things I take away from the book. I think, you know, the bits in live speech are really animated for me. I think that's all I wanted to say. Yeah, and you ask questions as if sometimes they just occurred to me, you know. Well, what about this? And have you ever thought about, you know, and here's a funny question. Are the kind of prefaces I imagine that you thinking in your head? I don't know if I'm way off beam. Perhaps you think of yourself as being cool and distant.
Yes, as you were saying, I was sort of animated and terrier-like. I was thinking, oh, I want to be all cool, actually. So, but no, that's great, Roger. Thank you. No, there was oh, terrier. Yeah, but maybe that's the pushiness. I don't know. I love the phrase animated seriousness. That's great. But of course, all the questions that have only just occurred to you, to one, you know, to me, because they must have just occurred to you, unless you've got a script of questions that you've, you know, which then aren't going to connect with what the person just said. So I suppose they have just occurred to you. So yeah, there's there's something I might have added to the second edition, because I don't know if it's, but there's something, the tape I use a lot, you know, and I draw from it in one of these, you know, they're all sort of like messed around, the transcripts in here, but they're based on these real people. And there's one, you know, the person says something and I say, oh, okay, so what would be the ... So what would you do next if that happened tomorrow? Or what's the first, you know? And so, and this person's talking quite fast herself. And so I talk about coming in with the word okay. And, you know, and I say, you know, when I'm teaching, I'll say at the heart of the approach is developing these skills of listening to someone and then listening. And only when they finish talking, just decide upon our utterance. And because we all do this in conversation all the time, you know, conversations, we're so skilled, you know, and but it can be difficult to think of what you're going to ask next. So we all devise ways of helping ourselves to do it. And, you know, when I saw Steve DeShazer either live or on tape, you know, there's amazing ways of giving himself time to think of a question, which is the way I saw it. Although he said he was not thinking, you know, it's just, that's opening up a whole nother area. So, okay, that's like a message. I'll take a turn now, but I'm not quite sure what I'm going to ask. So I've just said the word okay. So what would be ... pull out of the question. And in fact, what I do next is then just echo back what she said. So suppose you do get out of bed straight away. What would be the very first thing you'd do next after that? So this all happens like in a second or second and a half, or it's all, but actually when you see it, and I suppose this is, you know, what people who do microanalysis perhaps do or see, you sort of see, I can see the sort of the process there where I just gave myself a second or two to think of it. All the questions are just coming to you all the time. Yeah.
We've got sort of 3 minutes left. Does anybody else have any other thoughts, questions, things to share? While you're thinking, I'll share something just from my stand. What I was saying to Guy while you guys were in the rooms. I think I really enjoyed the book and how there were different sections in each chapter, because I think a lot of books that I read, if you're learning about, say, best hopes or preferred feature, they're talking about that now and what you do and what questions you ask. But I think I love the bits where it talked about the historical development and kind of how we, little, not massives, but just enough for me to kind of make sense of where it came from, how it developed into what it's developed into now. And one of the things I learned, which I didn't know, I knew about Erickson's crystal ball technique, but I didn't fully understand it in the way that Guy explained it, in that way of, imagine you have this crystal ball and you're imagining that future, and look back and how did you solve that problem to get to where you are now? And I just, yeah, it was interesting to think about that, because I always think about those historical developments and how you can bring those into the current practice. So that was something I really enjoyed about going through the book.
I just have one more thing to say, that it really I thought it was brilliant in the chapter about coping and managing, and in the way that you phrase your coping questions. You never use the word cope, which I think is brilliant, because if people are in a tough spot, if you use the word cope, as you said, Guy, they will say, well, I'm not coping, you're not listening to me. So it's always a better way to formulate those questions and show your acknowledgement, as opposed to use the word cope when people are actually in a tough spot. So yeah, that was really something that I'm taking from, something else that I'm taking from it, really. So I guess we're nearly there. We have 2 minutes left. Would like to thank you all for taking part in this. Guy, really thank you for sharing your thoughts, your other thoughts, apart from the thoughts that you shared in the book, which is plenty to discover and learn from. It's been really nice for me, and thank you very much for having me here, John. So yeah, and nice to meet you all.